Today I'm continuing work on the MD engine and we're going to install the crankshaft, which is kind of a big job. The first thing to do is to remove the main bearing caps and take those off, if they'll come off. Again, these are marked with the number from the front to the back, and the number goes on the camshaft side. You want to make sure you get them in the right orientation. And this will vary, but on this engine, the center bearing is the thrust bearing. It's got flanges on the side of it that mate in with the crankshaft to control end-to-end movement of the crankshaft. And these are my new bearings. This is the center thrust bearing pair and then the rest of the bearings. And if you look on any replacement bearing, they'll be marked. I don't know if you can see it there, but that says they were manufactured 11/10, November 2010, and they're 010 over, which matches my crankshaft. And then if we just check these other bearings for the mark, these say they were made also in November of 2010, and they're 10 over as well, so we should be good. So I'm going to start with the center thrust bearing. Of course, there's oil supply hole down there, and I'm going to match it up. One has this hole and one doesn't, and then there's an oil supply groove running around there. Now for these, the rest of the bearings, we've got half that have got oil supply holes in them and half that don't. So the ones with the oil supply holes in them obviously go in the top. So I've got all the top halves of the bearings in. I'm going to coat them with engine assembly lube. This stuff is sticky. I like that about it. Now always, before you put in the crankshaft, you got to check the timing marks on the camshaft. On this camshaft gear, we've got 2 punch marks here, and we've got a single punch mark here. Now here's where it gets confusing. On a normal gas Farmall, the single punch mark would be matched between the cam and the crankshaft, so you'd line up those 2 marks, and the double punch mark would be lined up between the camshaft and the governor and magneto or distributor gear, so that you've got your timing right on your engine. But we've got an injection pump as well as all those things on this engine. So let me read the INT. Oh my gosh, it's confusing. Mesh single punch mark on crankshaft gear with single punch mark on idler gear. Mesh double punch mark on idler gear with double punch mark on the injection pump drive gear. Mesh double punch mark on idler gear with double punch mark on camshaft gear. And mesh single punch on camshaft gear with single punch mark on magneto or distributor drive gear. Holy cow! Having read that, I'm going to put in the idler gear first and kind of break it down and step by step it. So my double punch mark on the camshaft gear is right here. We'll turn that around. Now the idler gear's got 2 holes in here. One is a blind hole for the pin in the back of the hub, and then the other one is an oil supply hole, so we got to make sure we line up those correctly. And then we got to get the double mark to line up with the double mark here. Just like that. Now this is going to be a little tricky because the crankshaft on this is heavy. I got the single punch mark on timing gear, and the single punch mark on the crankshaft gear has to align with that. Let me go get the crankshaft. And the crankshaft gear only has 1 mark, a single punch. There is no other marks around the gear, so that's what's got to align with the idler gear. Wow, that sucker is heavy. I knew it was not to be. There's the single mark on the idler, there's a single mark on the crank. The crank's got to turn a little bit. Probably in hindsight, it would have been easier to set the crank in and then put the idler in so that I could spin everything around to where it needed to be, but that ship has sailed. Well, instead of lifting the crank back out, I pulled out the idler gear, and then I can do my alignment that way. So single dot to single dot, and I gotta hold the bolt in here. Let's turn that crank a little bit. Ugh. These gears are marked a bit differently than the INT. So the cam gear's got a single dot here, which is the timing for the magneto or distributor over here. It's got a triple dot here, and there's a triple dot on the idler gear, so those two align. A single dot on the crank and on the idler gear here that align, and then there's a double dot here, which I assume aligns with a double dot on the injection pump. All right, this is the injection pump timing gear, and sure enough, my suspicions are correct. It has just a double dot mark on it, which aligns with the double dot on the idler. So that little mystery is solved. I can go ahead and put the nut on the idler gear, and we can proceed with setting the crankshaft. And I'm going to use some blue Loctite on this. I certainly don't want that to come loose, even though it's got a lock nut on it. Now then, we can assemble the bearing caps, put the inserts in them, and finally the big center bearing with the thrust bearing in it. Make sure it's clean. And once again, assembly lube on everything. Now first I'm going to set these on, and we've got the number there which goes toward the camshaft side. Set that in. Bearing number 4. Bearing number 1. Now I could put these washers on. Oh, the middle thrust bearing has larger studs on it than the other bearings. Well, that's interesting. I'll put all these washers on. Now I've got these main bearing cap nuts finger tight, and I'm just going to go through and snug them just a little bit with the wrench. It's just a feel thing. And then with them that way, I'm going to check the crankshaft, make sure it turns all right. Yep, that feels right. Some people will say don't touch the journals, they're so sensitive to a clean journal. I don't know. I make sure they're clean before I put the bearings on them, but I don't mind touching them. All right, the next step is to start torquing them down, and I found something interesting when looking for the torque values. I've got 5/8 inch diameter studs on every bearing except for the center thrust bearing. That's got 3/4 inch diameter studs on it. The INT manual is not really clear, but what I gather out of it is that the 5/8 inch studs get 150 to 175 foot-pounds of torque, and I know that torque is often expressed in pound-feet, but always in these mechanics publications it's foot-pounds. And that so the 5/8 are 150 to 75, the 3/4 are 250 to 275. I thought, man, that seems like an awful lot. Of course, these were torqued on by Thor or Hercules or somebody. They were really on there. So anyway, I was suspicious of that. I went inside and checked. I have a blue ribbon service manual, which I trust more than an INT manual. Those are the manuals that International produced for service technicians working on the engines. That manual says 125 foot-pounds for the 5/8 inch studs and 150 foot-pounds for the 3/4 inch main center studs. So that's what I'm going to use. My torque wrench is set to 150. I'm going to do the center one first. Check it. Still rotates good. And I'm going to go through and do this one by one. So torque down a bearing cap, check the rotation, torque down the next one, check the rotation. And I'm doing that so if I got a specific problem with clearance on a specific bearing, I'm going to know it. I'm going to know which one it is because the crankshaft will start dragging then. Check it. Now I got them all torqued down and the crankshaft feels the same as it did, so I know I don't have a problem. Next we're going to check the clearances. So from my INT manual, other series M69 diesels bearing running clearance should be 0027 to 0037. It's awful hard to measure to the 10,000ths, so I'm thinking 2,000ths to 3,000ths is where I want to be. And I have Plastigauge here that's meant to measure 1,000th to 3,000ths, so we'll try that. And since I've got so much money in this engine, usually I wouldn't check them all, I'd check a couple. I'm going to check them all. I'm going to take one cap off at a time and Plastigauge it while the other caps stay torqued down. That's important. So I've taken off number 2 bearing cap here, and I wanted to mention something. If you look at Plastigauge's recommendations, they say to Plastigauge the bearings dry with no assembly lube or oil put on the crankshaft. I've never done it that way. I would never recommend doing that. You want those journals coated with oil as soon as you put them in contact with the bearings, or you run the risk of scratching something, and I would never do that. I've always used grease. It's always worked out all right for me. I do clean it off where I'm going to put the Plastigauge. I think they say that so that you'll get a more accurate measurement without the assembly grease taking up some of the space. But when the engine's running, you're going to have oil taking up some of that space between the bearing and the journal. So I don't know. In fact, I always put a dab of grease around the Plastigauge to keep it from rolling off till I get everything in place. There's the Plastigauge. Here's the bearing cap. Make sure it's the right way. This is number 2. Now we're going to torque everything back down. Okay, so now everything's torqued. Now we're going to take it right back off and check the Plastigauge. .02, so it's 2,000ths to a little bit over 2,000ths. Spec was 027 to 037. So I'm good. So I'm going to go through and do this with every single main bearing, all 5 of them. I won't drag you all through that. I put the cap back on the one I test, and I torque it down, and then I move to the next one until I get through all 5. I'll let you know how it came out. Okay, I went all the way through all of them, Plastigauged them all. They all Plastigauged at 2,000ths to 3,000ths, and that's about as accurate as you can get with Plastigauge. They're all within tolerance. The crank feels all right when I turn it. And the next thing to do is put the cotter pins on to lock the castle nuts in place. Now obviously when you get to torque on the nut, it's not necessarily going to line up with the hole through that you put the cotter pin through. So sometimes you got to do a little turning to get things to line up. I like to err on the side of a little tight rather than a little loose. So usually I turn them to the right until I get them to line up. We'll go through and do that. That one will work. That one needs to be turned a touch to the right. Alright, I got them all tightened down. Now we can go ahead and put in the cotter pins. 1/8 inch by 1.5 is what it called for in the book. I am using 1/8 inch by 2 inch, and I'll just cut them to length. We're at a stopping point and I'm quitting for the day. Got the crank all in, got the cotter pins all in. The next step will be to put the pistons in and check the fit on the pistons. So stay tuned. I'll cover that next time I have a rainy day and I get to do this. Otherwise, I'm outside moving poop. Have a great day and I'll see you next time.